Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today, Rich DeFabritus, an expert in healthcare cyber intelligence, will discuss three aspects: an overview of the threat and the current state of healthcare cybersecurity, the methods attackers use to gain unauthorized access and why they do it, and what can be done to mitigate the risk of attack. Webinar Wednesday would like to thank our sponsor, CyberMDX. CyberMDX is a pioneer in medical cybersecurity and delivers zero-touch visibility and threat prevention for medical devices and clinical assets. Their mission is to enable healthcare delivery organizations worldwide to provide quality care by securing and protecting the systems and devices they rely on every day to treat illnesses and save lives. CyberMDX is fully HIPAA compliant and SOC 2 certified. They have been recognized as a global leader in the Forrester New Wave 2020 report and most recently received the Frost & Sullivan Technology Innovation Leadership Award for medical devices and asset security. For more information, please visit cybermdx.com. Let's give one lucky attendee the opportunity to win a Webinar Wednesday Webinerd t-shirt by answering the following questions. CyberMDX has built integration partnerships with industry leaders to develop and deliver innovative healthcare technology solutions. You can find a list of these partners on their website. Name one partner to win today's prize. You can answer now using the questions feature on your GoToWebinar dashboard. A couple of reminders before we get started. Registration is now open for MD Expo in Tampa this November. Visit mdexposhow.com to learn more about this one-of-a-kind conference where you can network with peers, earn CE credits, and learn the latest technologies and advances in HTM. If you are unable to join us in Tampa for the MD Expo, be sure not to miss our December HTM Mixer in Nashville, Tennessee on December 9th and 10th. Please visit HTM Mixer for more details on this event. As always, today's webinar is eligible for one continuing education credit from the ACI. You can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. More details on this at the end of today's webinar. We will wrap up today's presentation with a live Q&A. You can submit your questions anytime during the webinar by using the questions feature on the webinar dashboard. We will get through as many questions as possible during the webinar. As I mentioned earlier, our speaker today is Rich DeFabritus. Rich has more than 25 years of industry experience in product management and marketing and has worked for Avaya, Lucent Technologies, and Telcordia Technologies. Rich is currently the Senior Director of Product Marketing at CyberMDX and works to increase awareness of the cybersecurity threat that faces hospitals today. Rich, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Great, Jennifer, thank you. That was a very impressive introduction, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar. As mentioned, I'm going to go through how hospital hacks happen. So part of what we'll discuss. I think it's really important to take a look at the current state of healthcare cybersecurity. Obviously, if you're here, you have similar thoughts and concerns about what's happening. It helps to paint context and prepare us for, ultimately, the last piece of this. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the ways that hackers can penetrate or breach your networks. And this will be a look at some data in the industry that I hope, again, gives perspective, as well as, some fact-based or actual hacks, just to give you an idea of, how creative and how these malicious actors are getting unauthorized access to your networks. And then the last piece we'll talk about is, how to mitigate that, right? How to, sort of stem the tide, and what are the things you can do. There may be some quick wins, and then there may be some longer term things you should be looking at that can help you in the fight against cyber attackers. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody that October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, sponsors this or publishes this, and they remind you to do your part and be cyber smart. Since we're focused mostly on the healthcare industry here, and we know that the healthcare industry is relying more and more on medical or connected medical devices to improve patient care and organizational efficiency, while there's increasing benefits to adopting such technology, it also exposes us to additional vulnerabilities that cyber criminals can exploit. So again, do your part, be cyber smart, and keep in mind that the third week of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month focuses on the healthcare industry. So our webinar today is pretty timely. Okay, let's look at the current state of healthcare cybersecurity. But before I get into that, I want to make this a little interactive, keep you guys engaged. You can type answers in the chat area of GoToWebinar for this. There's no real right or wrong answer. Really what I'm using these questions for is just to frame the conversation, because I'll come back to them later in the presentation. But I'll ask the first question. Today, is your organization, or are you, if you're responsible for it, educating your employees about cybersecurity awareness? Any kind of training that you're doing around cybersecurity awareness? And this would be to essential and non-essential employees. So I'll give you a second to respond. Yes, no, or don't know. Okay, good. See a couple yeses, couple no's. Yep, all good. Let's look back at 2019. I give you sort of a perspective again around healthcare cybersecurity in the current state. In 2019, in the United States alone, we had over 400 separate breaches. And this lends credence to or support to the idea that healthcare is one of the most targeted sectors of the US economy. Okay, those over 400 breaches yielded or potentially exposed almost 40 million records to cyber criminals. Doesn't mean they necessarily were stolen, but potential, they're exposed, potentially could be stolen, which translates into roughly about 1 out of 8 to 10 Americans. That's just in 2019 alone. Okay, so pretty significant number of records that are exposed, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's important. In terms of cost to the U.S. healthcare system, so whether this is cost to shore up a breach, fines, ransomware, any other types of costs, this is costing the U.S. healthcare system about $4 billion. And that is not an insignificant amount. Okay, so if anyone didn't think this was a serious situation, these numbers should be pretty sobering. And what makes that even more interesting, I'm trying to advance my slides here, is that if I overlaid what's happening in 2020, which is the red line you see here, with what has happened in 2019, you can clearly see that this is not decreasing. Okay, and one could argue, although the trend line seems to kind of follow, you see some spikes there in February and particularly in June, it's actually going up. Okay, we think, and these are reported breaches to Health and Human Services. This does not include, and I'll probably say this a few times, there was a recent breach of a very large healthcare system. I will not mention names. That hasn't been officially reported yet, so it's not in these numbers. But one could make the assumption that organizations are doing more to try to prevent breaches from happening, and yet we're not really seeing any decrease or any decline in the number of attacks. And if you just to take a look at any particular month here, you see you're running right around 40 breaches a month, which is pretty significant. Okay, understand, and again, I don't know everyone that's on the call here, but understand that cybersecurity. Okay, if I have this conversation with my family, I get some very interesting looks. Although I've spent quite a few years in the cybersecurity industry, it's no longer a technical issue, right? It's moved far beyond the domain of just IT, and organizations I think are beginning to recognize that within healthcare and outside of healthcare. But understand, it's not just a technical issue, right? It is a patient safety issue. Let's talk a little bit about that in the next slide. It's a threat to data security. It's a huge risk to your financials, which I kind of said in one of the previous slides. And then overarching that is the loss of reputation or reputational risk, right? So patients trust you with their care, with keeping their records private. And so all of these things can be impacted by a cyber breach. So I mentioned that it can be a patient safety issue. For many years, this has sort of been talked about. It's now become a reality. So within the last month or two, there was a ransomware attack against a hospital in Europe, which caused the shutdown of critical systems in the hospital. And one patient needed immediate care. And during the shutdown and the chaos of the attack, they attempted to transport the patient to another hospital, and the patient died as a result. So one of the first, if not the first, known instances where patient safety was beyond a mistreatment. The patient actually lost their life as a result of it. Okay. The American Medical Association conducted a survey of physicians in the United States, asking them about their concerns and what are the top concerns around cyber attacks. And more than half of them said threats to patient safety, right? So this, again, is no longer something we're talking about. This is a reality. And if we were to look at the trends in the previous slides, as this continues to happen at the level that it's happening at, we should expect to see more and more of incidents like this happening. I think we're probably lucky it hasn't happened previously up until this point. Okay, and that if a medical device has been impacted, if there's a failure or there's a shutdown as a result of a breach, it can lead to mistreatment or misdiagnosis, which could result in an injury or death of a patient, as I said. Part of why that's remains a high concern is that so many medical devices that are still in service remain unpatched. They're running either unsupported or older operating systems that have known vulnerabilities, and they need to be updated, and they haven't been. Okay, so numbers there, again, 50 to 60% of those medical devices, and may even be higher, remain unpatched. Well, those are breach points, right? They're vulnerabilities in your network. We talked about data security, and I'll spend a little time on this too. Patients obviously trust HDOs with their records, not just their care, but also keeping what they're having done or anything that they provide to you that's private, right? And if you're in the industry, very well about that, or very much about that. Unfortunately, with the level of breaches that are happening, we consistently see patient records being exposed and or sold online. And there's some instances here that I can call out. 740-bed hospital in New York City deactivated the network server, and records for 6,800 individuals were exposed and found online. 450-bed hospital in California, data from 20,000 patient records were posted online. Okay, so they're finding these things actually out there. According to Comparatech, in a report they published in February 2020, some of all the breaches between 2016 and 2019 yielded 6.6 million stolen records. Okay, so that's just a huge amount. And again, I'll give some perspective in some later slides, but that's, the data security issue, right? And clearly this is what's happening. And then, of course, I said, the crippling the financials. In particular, I'll focus on ransomware, because ransomware is amongst, if not the fastest growing cybercrime, not just in healthcare, outside of healthcare, but particularly within the healthcare industry. We're seeing more and more ransomware attacks. In 2019, according to Emsisoft, there were 759 healthcare providers globally hit with ransomware attacks, and the average incidence cost was about $8 million. Just to give a data point, this same report suggested, I'm not sure that it's 100% believable, but suggested that in the banking industry, they had 0 ransomware attacks in that same time period. Having done some cybersecurity in the financial world, I'm not sure that that's true, but I can tell you that that number is certainly very low. Okay, so we probably want to dig deep into why maybe in the financial sector it's not such a big deal, or it's not as prominent as it is in the healthcare industry. And oh, by the way, COVID-19 pandemic really intensified the challenges that you guys are facing, right? Obviously, it's very important that you keep your staff, whether essential and non-essential, safe. You have a need for these employees to work remote. And then, of course, the need to serve patients possibly remote or in a safe environment. And more as non-essential employees or things like telehealth come into play, obviously we introduce a potential for new vulnerabilities or new breach points, right? So if you have a worker that's now working remote, they may be using a personal network that's unprotected, or they may be using a device that they are also using, like a smartphone, to go on social networks, right? You may have needed new connected medical devices to allow a patient to be monitored remotely. That may introduce new vulnerabilities. So all these things are playing a role in why healthcare is such a big target. And it's more than just a big target, it's kind of a soft target. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about that here, right? There's just a huge number of vulnerable endpoints. The average US hospital has roughly 30,000 endpoints, and that is growing. Okay, so as I said when I talked about National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, the proliferation of these devices, they certainly help with operational and organizational efficiency, but it means more and more that you have to buckle them down and make sure that they're secure. There's far too many devices to manage. Okay, so the average biomedical engineer manages about 1,400 devices, and you've got to make sure that they're all running the latest software, the latest patches. You've got to know where they're located. You may need to know if there's known vulnerabilities on those, right? How do you do that, right? There's very limited resources to keep what I'll call comprehensive inventories of these devices. And I have some data that says, roughly a quarter to a third of all hospitals admit to not being able to reliably account for these devices, or they do it manually, which is very interesting. So the question is, why? Why is this happening? Well, very simple. At the moment, it's a financial thing. Okay, so I did mention the patient safety thing. That's certainly creeping in, but right now it's a financial issue. The value of personal health or protected health information data sold in the black market is very high. Okay, so I've heard a bunch of numbers. They go for $1,000 a record. They go for $500 a record. Yeah, that may be a little bit optimistic or a little high. One of the better reports I saw said that if you were to compare the value of PHI data or health records to like maybe passwords or social security numbers, those would go for maybe $1 to $2, where the health record would go for about $250. So orders and orders of magnitude higher. Just to give again some perspective here, so one of the most notorious or well-known cyber attacks in recent history is something called the Bangladesh bank heist. I'm not sure if anyone here knows about that or knows what that was, so I'll give a little bit of an explanation. But the Bangladesh bank heist was an attack against what is called the SWIFT network, which is a banking network that banks use to do interbank transactions, send money, etc. So it's a private network between banks. The nation state that conducted the attack is one that's under very significant sanctions. pretty well known to be notorious for things like this, and they attempted to steal about $1 billion. Okay, they conducted the attack on a weekend, and they were unfortunate, or fortunately for the banking industry, somebody I think in New York was able to determine there was a typographical error on one of the transaction records, and they stopped it. Okay, they still got away with $90 million, but the attempt was to get $1 billion. And $1 billion, it's obviously a lot of money. You wonder why a nation state would put such interest behind hitting a banking network. Well, this particular nation state, $1 billion represented a not insignificant portion of their GDP. Okay, it was a significant amount of money for them. Okay, a nation state, not a kid in the basement, a nation state. So I said that the PHI data or health records may be going for around $250 a record. I will show later on in the presentation some of the more recent hacks on hospital networks, and you'll see data records exposed in the millions. One was 3 million records in one single hack. Again, not stolen, but exposed, potentially hacked. Well, if I take $250 and multiply that by 3 million, it's about $1 billion. Okay, so you see why it's such a big target. Because it's a soft target, it's a little easier to penetrate the networks, and the value of this information is so much that you will see, if you haven't already seen it, and we do know it's happened in some cases, nation states initiating attacks against hospitals. Okay, so this is a very concerning data point. Okay, so let's look at ways that hackers can attack your network. Okay, and I'm going to go through, like I said, a couple examples that were real examples, just to kind of give you an idea, and then some data around it. But I want to ask a second question. Okay, is your organization, or are you using any kind of an email protection system or spam filter for your email accounts? And the same thing, and yes, no, don't know. Just make sure that you're engaged, and again, I'll tie this back to a point that I'll make in the presentation. Okay, so when we look at breaches, and this is all breach categories for current year to date for 2020. Okay, when you look at breaches that happen against hospitals, and again, this is HHS data. These are reported breaches against hospitals or against healthcare industry organizations. This does not include, just so you know, this will not include, again, the most recent sort of in the news hack that's happened, which was a ransomware attack. So it would be categorized as a hacking incident. I want to be very clear that hacking remains the most common form of breach. Okay, and it's important to call that out because of all the things we talked about, from a current state perspective, that malicious actors are attempting to get access to your network, right? There are other types of breaches, obviously, something we'll call unauthorized access. It may be, a benign, a mistake, right? Or an internal actor that does something, unintentional. Sure, there are malicious internal actors, but the primary thing we're talking about here is external actors hacking into the network. 60% of the breaches are hacking incidents in 2020. That's up about 1% over 2019. Again, not including the breach that I just talked about. It is responsible for, again, 90% of all the breach records. Okay, so very significant. And I do want to point some other things out that are very interesting, completely off topic, but just something to make you go, maybe there is a tie in here. Improper disposal, you see 4%. There was a recent breach, you'll see on the next slide, where physical media was discarded. About 500,000 records were exposed. So don't underestimate, how human error plays a role here, because it most certainly does. These attacks, they're getting increasingly sophisticated. The attacks aren't just against hospitals. The attacks could be against third parties, an associate that you outsource services to, or a supply chain, right? A supplier that, you order, supplies from. It could be a health plan, right? It could be the hospital itself. Still, the bulk of them, as I said, were hacking incidents. But if you look at the location, or really the breach point, This is really the location of the records, but the point of access, network servers, emails, laptops, desktop computers, they run the gamut. Okay, these are the, by the way, just as a data point, so you guys know, these are the most recent 2020 attacks. These are the top attacks in terms of the impacted records. So that's the second column you see there. And I referenced in a previous slide about 3 million records were exposed. Well, here was a situation where 3.3 million records were potentially exposed. And you can see there's quite a few of them that are very large. Okay, these are just 2020. And what do I have here? Maybe 18, 19, okay? Big and high volume of records being exposed and potentially stolen. Okay, so this is not a question I need you to type into the chat window, but I'll ask the question and I want you to think about it. Some of you may know this, some of you may not know it, but it is very interesting to take a look at and again, tie the bow around the conversation we're having here. What do you think the initial point of compromise is for hospitals? What do you think the top ranking breach point is for hospital? I think probably most of you know, and if you thought to yourself or you answered email, you would be right. Okay, so email, not just in the healthcare industry, in other industries as well, still remains your primary point of compromise for a breach or a hacking incident. And I want to tie into that where I talked a little about human error plays a role here. Now, these numbers won't add up to 100% because they can be more than one a point of compromise, right? Obviously, an email might be a point of compromise, but an email could have been exposed, or passwords could have been exposed through human error. Someone puts their password on a piece of paper, or someone clicks on a malicious attachment in a phishing email. That's human error, okay? The next would be medical and IoT devices, which is something, we'll talk, a little bit about. The next would be third-party vendors. And tied in with third-party vendors, and of course, your hospital as well, but we tend to see these more, external to the organization, would be website hacks. So some malicious or malware is placed on a website, and someone unknowingly clicks on that malware and infects your network, and the malware propagates to the network. So this comes from a HIMSS survey, HIMSS cybersecurity survey. Overlays really well with what I showed you on the previous slide. Roughly 60% of these are malicious actions. Some of them might be malicious insiders, but for the most part, they're hackers and nation states waging attacks against hospitals. And then the remainder of them might not be benign. Like I said, certainly third parties or business associates you have, they're not intentionally trying to hack into your network, but they may get hacked and expose you to something that's happened, or even unknowingly. Again, if you're going to a supplier and their website has been somehow attacked, you could be impacted by that. So let's look at how they hack. And again, I think I referenced this. This is an actual incident that happened. So all of these incidents will be actual incidents that happened. Again, just to give you sort of a flavor of how these things are taking place. In this particular case, it was a phishing attack that exposed staff email credentials and passwords to a cyber criminal. Okay, that hacker was then able to access numerous staff email accounts, and using those accounts was able to traverse through a network and get access to records. This despite the fact that the hospital had an email security system. The breach went unknown for months. Okay, so we can have discussions around the average time to identify a breach, depending on the industry. It's something I know, well about, or quite a bit about. But in a case here, months is probably long, but not out of the realm of incredibility or anything like that. We've heard of breaches unknown for over a year. Okay, but typically they may be around 1 to 2 months. In this case, they think it was way longer than that. Okay, and it was so long that the actual impact to the patient records was unknown. This particular organization hired a third-party forensics team to do an analysis, and they still couldn't figure out what the impact was. That's not to say that the impact was minimal. They don't know. They don't know if it was a lot, if it was a little. So it was kind of up in the air. Unfortunately, because they didn't really know, there wasn't much they could do to mitigate or ensure or give faith to their patients that they weren't impacted, and so they had to take steps to protect them. But a lawsuit was subsequently filed, and the claim that was made is that the staff was not properly trained to identify phishing attacks. Now, I said this was a hospital that actually used the system. It's probably safe, an email protection system. It was probably safe to assume they've done some kind of training because they're using an email protection system. So people have to know sometimes your emails will be quarantined because there may be a malicious attachment. So you'd assume there'd be some type of training or education around that. And education certainly helps. So I don't want to dismiss the idea that educating your staff is not a good thing to do. It's actually an excellent thing to do, and we'll talk about that later. But is it enough? Is it just enough to, just to prevent something from happening? Or is the training itself even comprehensive enough to prevent something like this from happening? Well, let's take a data point, again, from that same HIMSS cybersecurity report in 2019. Some organizations, what they'll do is conduct what they call phishing tests. Well, they'll send internally to their employees a fake phishing email. I think that might be a redundant statement, but you get what I'm saying. A fake phishing email to their employees. And what they want to see is that less than 10% of those emails are actually clicked on. There's a phony, malicious attachment in that email. They want to make sure that 10% or less open and or click on the email. They want them to report it. And fair to say, or nice to see, that 45% of the organization said, yes, we had less than 10%. Okay, unfortunately, there were about 25% of the organizations that had over 10%. Okay, so this means, right, even with training, even with having a system in place, a quarter of these organizations see their employees more than 10% of the time clicking on these emails. 20% didn't even know if they did anything like that, which is probably safe to say they're not doing it, because if you are doing this, you'll know that the company's doing it. It's very clear. When my last company did this, it was pretty obvious. They gave you a button to press if you think this is a phishing email, and you pressed it. And 10% of the organization said they did no testing. So 55% of the organizations, they may not be doing enough here to prevent that from happening. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that email remains still one of the most breached, or the most popular method for which hackers get into your network. So something to think about. Let's look at medical devices. So I said that was another area that is a vulnerable point for hospitals. And again, this is an actual incident. Some of you may know about this incident. It was a very publicized, pretty much worldwide incident. Ransomware was targeting servers and devices running Windows 7 and other unpatched operating systems. So this was a known exploit or a known vulnerability in Windows 7 that Microsoft actually earlier in that year released a patch to close the vulnerability up. This particular healthcare organization did not implement the patch and admitted to it in the post-mortem of the attack. And yet infection came via an exposed, what they call server message block, or SMB port. Very common way for hackers to get access to a server or connected medical device. And up to 70,000 devices were infected. This would be MRI imaging machines, blood refrigerators, servers. Recognizing that the attack had hit, what this healthcare organization did was shut everything down. Seems like a drastic action to take, but in this case, it actually helped to some extent. I'm going to talk about that because in the mayhem of the shutdown, someone was able to figure out what they sometimes call the kill switch, a way to stop propagation of the ransomware. But in shutting down the systems, all non-emergency admissions had to stop. All ambulances were diverted. About 7,000 appointments were canceled, and about, I think, 150 of those appointments were critical patients, some of them cancer patients. So it's unknown whether or not this attack led to some impact to the patient's safety, but it's hard to argue against the fact that it did, okay, because they were turned away. Everything was shut down. Sometimes people will crinkle their nose at this and say, yeah, we've heard the alarm bells sounding, but here's actual proof of a medical device in the United States that had this particular piece of ransomware on it. Okay, so this was after the attack, which was, again, pretty much a worldwide, publicized event, and yet it still exists or existed on a device in the United States. Okay, and you won't understand why that's happening. I talked about how roughly 50 to 60% of these devices are unpatched. Keep in mind, broader than that, many of them are still running an unsupported operating system. So Windows 7 or Windows XP, and these are long unsupported. I know Microsoft extended on Windows 7, particularly for the healthcare industry, but for the most part, it's an unsupported operating system. 27% of these devices are assumed to be running Windows XP, and most of the traffic in between these devices are unencrypted. Okay, I mentioned SMB on the previous page. It's something that, also probably a little more prominent is something called RDP or Remote Desktop Protocol. That is a mechanism by where, through Windows, you can access remotely another server. And typically, RDP exposes a particular port. I think in this case, it's mostly port 3389. I don't know if I should be saying that. I don't think there's any hackers on the call, but that's pretty well known. And how many hospitals, if they're not patching their servers, are closing the access port for these? Because I think they ship default with it open. Okay, there are threat actors. In particular, I know one that I could name, a group that is selling RDP access on the dark web. So they know that these servers are exposed. They know where they are, IP addresses, and they can easily get access to it, drop malware on it, propagates to the network, and away they go. Okay, that's pretty scary, right? And again, lest anyone think like sort of the patient safety thing, it was talked about a lot. The evidence is right here. This is from the manufacturer of said device showing it, okay? There are things you can do to take care of that. Obviously, patch the software. And if possible, although we know it's not that easy to do, these devices are expensive. And if they are running something like Windows 7, you can't just say upgrade the operating system. We understand that, but you could do something like segment your network, where you're taking some of these devices, putting them on their own subnet and protecting that network by restricting the traffic that goes in and out of that subnet. Okay, that's a way that you can sort of protect them. Okay, and I will bring in here that COVID-19 factor, the pandemic factor. We all understand in the rush to get the hospital workers and or patients service remotely, security wasn't prioritized during that time. And this data here that I'm showing on the slide comes from an actual roundtable that we held with CISOs and security professionals at hospitals. Okay, so this is some of the feedback that they had given us, right? Security was a little bit of a lower priority, and hackers, they know that, and they're taking advantage of it. And it's something I will show on the next hack where you can see that's happened. Hospitals now are kind of just recovering from all that. Remote operations have been sort of sustained and for the most part kind of humming along, and maybe some security has been applied there, but the focus is now turning back to caring for in-house operations. But again, the same issues still apply: the resources, funding, etc. You just lost, we're in October, 10 months, right? Well, maybe it hit in February, so 9 months, right? So that's another delay that potentially impacts, stopping or mitigating hacks from external actors. Some hospitals, what they've done, you could kind of question whether this is good or bad. Instead of buying new equipment where they needed it, what they would do is buy similar models of things like infusion pumps or ventilators, because there wouldn't be the need to do crash course training. It was already known and they knew how to use it, and probably a little easier to secure out of the box, assuming that everything was patched and everything was, cared for. So I thought that was a very interesting approach that some of the hospitals took. But keeping in mind that obviously this is kind of a force majeure. It's not anything within your control. It only made your life that much more difficult in terms of securing these. Okay, this is the last one that I'll focus on. I mentioned the website, or websites can be a way that hackers gain access or can infect your network. What they do is they can create, a bogus website infected with malware. And if you go to visit that site, then you perform some action, click on something, the malware is downloaded to the computer of the unsuspecting visitor, and then without their permission, it's placed on their laptop or placed on their computer, and it runs through the network. They also do this through legitimate sites. And again, there's one pretty well-known incident where I will name the company. It was Forbes magazine, and Forbes. If you go to Forbes.com, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to have what was called the quote of the day. Okay, and they had a high amount of traffic, people going to this quote of the day. It was kind of an inspirational quote. Someone would go there, they click on it. There was a little pop-up that came up, they click on it, and they get a nice quote. Again, a nation state, knowing that this was a highly visited, a high traffic site, they actually infiltrated that quote of the day and made the pop-up malware so that when you clicked on the quote of the day, you downloaded malware to your laptop, and that was that. And it went, unnoticed for quite some time. Okay. There's other incidents, which I'll show on the next slide, where it's a bogus website, but either way, you have to be cognizant of that. Where this becomes an issue is a lot of hospitals are running older browsers. For example, it might be IE6. I'm personally a user of Firefox, and I use some other, secure browsers, but Firefox is another one that, they've had some issues of recent times. You've got to make sure that you have those browsers up to date, and you should be considering things like whitelists or making sure that you have safe sites that you're allowing employees to visit. I'm sure everybody has seen this. This is an example of a watering hole attack, right? Everyone has probably seen this. This is Johns Hopkins COVID-19 dashboard. You couldn't turn on the TV and not see this earlier this year. And I think people were so intrigued and enthralled and nervous about what was going on, that they wanted to see what was happening here, maybe at the state level or at the low, a drilled down level, that they rushed out to the internet and they put COVID map in, and a website comes up, maybe top of the list in a Google, COVID19map.com or coronavirusmap.com. And there was actually quite a few of them. This is taken from one of those sites. It's a bogus website that when people visited it, they were infected. World Health Organization, same thing. Site was spoofed. It was malware, and people had their laptops or their PCs infected. Okay, so you can see how easy something like this could happen. Anybody that is looking at this and in the hubbub or the chaos of what's happening, anybody could click on this. You could be experienced person and not realize, and something can happen. It's that easy, but you do have to be on your game and on your toes to know that it is actually happening. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mitigating the threats, right? And there's a thought I have there, but let's just go to our last question. Does your organization, or do you guys have a cyber incident response plan for your practice and patients? And yes, no, or don't know. Okay, good. So there's a reason why I asked that question, right? And the other questions I said earlier. Something that you can see here, and this comes from IBM. This is their 2020 cost of a data breach report. I don't want you to focus so much on the dollar figures, but focus more on the green and the red bars, because the dollar figures are some quantification of reducing the cost impact, but what they really mean is reducing the threat, right? So there are things you can be doing here to help reduce the threat, and there are things that you might do that could increase the threat, right? So if I jump down to the red bar, the first one, having a remote workforce. We've talked about that quite a bit, particularly in the pandemic. That increases your threat. right? Obviously, a lost or stolen device increases the threat of a breach, right? IoT or any operational technology impacted, again, increases the potential for a breach happening, right? Any kind of compliance failures. But if we look at the opposite end, what are things that we can do to reduce that? And I did mention employee training. You know, that's a great thing to do. Just make sure that the employee training is taken seriously, that it's comprehensive, right? That it's not just, you know, here, just do this because we want to meet some kind of requirements and go away with it, right? Because the reason I asked question 1 and 2, those blue questions I asked, again, we see email as a primary breach point. We know that most people are training their employees and running some kind of a phishing, anti-phishing software, and yet we're still seeing the impact there. Okay, so something has to change, and it's likely down to human error there. But there are other things you can do, like analytics. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that, or having incident response. You know, so incident response is near and dear to my heart. In my last company, I wrote a white paper about it, and you will be surprised to know that only about 40% of the organizations in the United States actually have incident response, you know, any sort of incident response capability. Okay, which is very interesting considering that we're in a paradigm where we're moving beyond prevention, right? There really is no such thing as 100% security. So I talked a little bit about, or I mentioned, you know, I think I mentioned perimeter security, right? Like how things are changing here. We're beyond you know, that paradigm, right? You can't think of, you know, building a castle with a moat filled with water and sharks with lasers in it. That doesn't work any longer. Okay, you surely want to prevent or hamper, you know, an entry point to your network, but now you also have to have effective alerting, you know, a way to quarantine or a containment plan, and mitigation, right? Mitigation. Okay, so when I think of mitigation, I think of incident response as an example. You know, what do you do when this happens? I mean, think about incident response, I tend to think about the Titanic. The Titanic was a boat that was unsinkable. So they really didn't have a plan for when the inevitable sinking happened. And unfortunately, because they didn't have a plan, people's lives were lost. Okay, so you've got to be thinking about that. You have to assume that a breach is going to happen. Okay, and you've got to take appropriate measures if and when that breach occurs. You want to identify it and respond to it. You want to contain it or quarantine the devices to stop the data loss. I talked about the one ransomware attack where the hospital took a very drastic, or the healthcare organization took a very drastic action of shutting down the entire network. That's a little bit much, but it helped to stop it. Okay, they contained it. Now, if you could get visibility down to the device or devices that had been impacted, you could just quarantine them. That would be a great way to go. Okay, you want to make sure you secure any exploitable paths and surfaces. I talked about RDP, okay, and how traffic in between devices is unencrypted. So think about segmenting your network. And lastly, if you have a breach or you've had a breach, apply lessons learned, do a postmortem, understand what happened, and what are the things you can do to shore up. And from a recommendations perspective, you know, there's, again, some maybe quick wins if you're not already there. You definitely want to be using some kind of an email system, regardless of what I said about email still being, you have to have something that's going to quarantine malicious attachments. It may not stop 100% of it, but if it stops 50% of it, that's an improvement. Make sure you educate your employees. Do more than just the regular education. They have to be thinking about social engineering. Before we got on this call, we talked about, you know, myself and a colleague talked about how sophisticated these are getting. And we are people in the industry, and I have to think about it, right? And I know that it's fake, but I have to look at it just a little longer. Someone without having that knowledge might not think the same way. From a website perspective, I said already, create a safe browsing list or a whitelist. Make sure you're blocking known malicious sites. And then let's get into something maybe a little bit more long-term. Think about getting performing a risk assessment of your connected medical devices. Okay, you want to focus on or get visibility into these devices to know what needs to be patched, what needs to be secured based on the asset criticality. Okay, so medical device or connected device, an IoT device may not be an infusion pump. It may be, I'm making this up, a printer or something, right? That's not a critical asset. Focus on the critical assets and the likelihood of the impact in the case of an event or a breach. And you should be looking at a vulnerability assessment, looking at your managed and unmanaged devices, understanding, if there are known vulnerabilities or what vulnerabilities may exist or how you can shore that up. And lastly, think about network segmentation. It's a complex process. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do or a quick thing to do, but it is something you should really be thinking about doing if you're not already doing it. And just my last slide, how can CyberMDX help? Well, we have something we call our healthcare security suite. This is software that would run, in the cloud that helps to identify, assess, detect and prevent and analyze your IoT or connected medical devices. What we would do is, continuous discovery and deep visibility, or what we say 360-degree visibility into all your connected assets. So you're going to know what that asset is, the name of it, what software it's running, where it's located, are there known vulnerabilities. That's all part of the software suite, right? We can help you to build a healthcare context risk assessment, provide some security insights, and or remediation plans. We can also detect anomalies and look at malicious activities, and then help you take preventative measures to reduce the attack surface. And lastly, something I think is very important, particularly from like an HTM or biomed perspective, looking at things like asset utilization and ensuring critical services and availability of the devices. Where are they located? Are they being used, etc. Okay. And with that, I would say thank you. Jennifer, I think we might open it up for questions.
That's right, Rich. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in from the audience, but as a reminder for those of you new to our webinar format, if you would like to ask a question, please use the question feature on your webinar dashboard, and we will be able to take any of those for today. If we cannot get to any of your questions today, we will be answering those via email afterward. Our first question, Rich, is what are the benefits of a risk assessment and how can I get started with doing that?
Okay. Well, a risk assessment certainly is going to help, and I think I mentioned this a little bit. It's going to help you to recognize internal and external threats, any potential threats, as well as any vulnerabilities for each of the devices on your network. If you take it to that level, which you should, right? It should be very in depth. There's a compliance element here, right? From a compliance perspective, a risk assessment might be, or is the initial point of a HIPAA audit. And in order to meet HIPAA requirements, hospital would need to represent full control of risk management. So the compliance piece obviously is very important. A risk assessment can help prevent, potential damage and or reduce cost. So if you know of the threats and those potential vulnerabilities, you can prevent any kind of a mistake or any kind of a breach, and better prepare yourself in the case or in a worst case scenario. One thing I think is really important, and I kind of, again, said this maybe on the previous slide, prioritizing tasks for IT and security departments, right? So you can improve productivity by focusing on which devices are critical, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to focus too much on things, like I said, the operating system of a printer. It doesn't mean that it can't be breached. We understand that, but maybe the priority is something like an infusion pump or a ventilator where a patient could be impacted adversely as a result of it. So it can help you prioritize things there. And last, it kind of helps with decision making, right? The level of information you're going to get from a risk assessment is going to help with that, because you need to have everybody sort of on the same page about what the major threats are, what needs to be done, and having the resources to tackle it. In terms of how to get started, I'd say we have an ecosystem of partners that can help with that. I talked a little bit about the CyberMDX software that can also help. And I don't know, Joe, you're on the line. Maybe you can inject something here. No,
you got it covered.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you, guys. Our next question is, what are some of the challenges facing HDOs with respect to their cybersecurity posture?
Okay, so challenges above and beyond, kind of what I spoke about. Although, I think I did mention this on one of the slides. I'd say, out of the gate, the proliferation of, mobile devices, IoT, and connected medical devices. I talked about how, the average hospital in the U.S. has about 30,000 connected devices. With such proliferation and sort of the way that now things are architected, right? You may have people working from home. You may be doing telehealth with patients. That traditional view of perimeter security, it's not sufficient any longer to protect an organization, right? It's like a first line of defense, but it's not enough. The network has now become part of the attack surface, and that attack surface has increased. And organizations really are struggling to keep pace with that. Okay, the more these devices come online, they have to secure them. It's happening at a pace faster than organizations can keep up with, and that's certainly one of the biggest challenges. I'd say secondarily, or maybe not secondarily, maybe it's like tied hand in hand with it. Things like cloud technologies, like cloud and virtualization, the blending of IT and OT. That's resulted in new security considerations. And by that, what I mean is there's a complexity in managing these technologies. So it's not just the volume, it's the complexity, right? Sometimes I think I've heard say it's, volume, velocity, and variation, right? There's so many different things and technologies and architectures that, again, protecting all of that is really, really difficult and very challenging. And then the last thing I would say is the threats, and I did talk about this on one slide, they're becoming very sophisticated. Okay, they aren't, I know we've heard of situations, outside of healthcare where, an individual can attack a network, and it's not to say that individuals don't do that, but let's just bring it up a lot. We are talking about known threat groups that could be sponsored and or funded by nation states. Okay, we spoke about ransomware attacks, and they're growing, and social engineering, and it's making it extremely difficult to identify, a phishing attack, what's real and what's not real. You're no longer getting, an email, and I'm not making light of this, but you're no longer getting sort of that Nigerian banking scam. You're getting, emails from people within your organization. Hey, send me that presentation from yesterday, and you're not thinking, or you're in a hectic paced environment, and you click something, and you've infected a network. So the fact that the threats are becoming so sophisticated, they're continuing to grow in number, and they continue to get more intense, and they continue to become more successful. That's a huge challenge. How do you stop all of that? So I'd say those are the three things that, I think above and beyond what we talked about are real challenges facing HDOs in terms of cybersecurity posture.
Thank you so much, Rich, for a fantastic presentation. I would like to encourage everyone to visit today's sponsor, CyberMDX, to learn more about the products they provide to our industry. Please visit CyberMDX.com. A quick reminder that you can obtain your continuing education certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. The survey will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your continuing education credit from the ACI, and you will be able to download the certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, please reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. We will be back next week with another webinar. please visit webinarwednesday.live for more details and complimentary registration.